Thank you very much, Diane. That was excellent. And certainly in the years that I've been involved in exporting and supporting export businesses, there's sort of two halves to exporting. And there's the whole business management strategy and a lot of the elements that one needs to develop. And Diane's spoken very eloquently about some of those. But the other half is the details and the rules. And so our next speaker in the Canadian importing context will speak to that, and that's Carol West with the Canadian Society of Customs Brokers.
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. Diane remarked on how, in spite of all the warmth that was generated this morning in this room, that the temperature seemed a bit chilly. Well, let me just say it wasn't nearly as chilly as the day that I was sitting in my Ottawa office in the winter and received a visit from three amazing women, the ambassador and high commissioners from Zimbabwe, Rwanda, and Lesotho. Their vision about this conference, their dream of having you all in this room, and their sense of the empowerment that all of us could gain from speaking about women entrepreneurs globally and more specifically in Africa was amazing. And I want to congratulate them on the success of this conference and thank them for the opportunity to support it. We're a sponsor, a small sponsor here, and also through speaking. So congratulations and thank you very much. Now, in spite of all of the stuff that we've talked about today and heard about today about partnerships and people and connections and networks, the unfortunate reality that I have to talk about is that borders divide. And there are obstacles. And hopefully I'm going to try and outline what some of those obstacles may be so that you're aware of them. I'm going to try and talk about what you can do to surmount those obstacles. And as I was developing this presentation, I thought I probably have a little bit of a subversive agenda, and my subversive agenda, I'll say it out loud, is probably to suggest to some of you that you may want to get into the business of being customs brokers in your country. So we'll see where that goes and where we end up. Borders do affect investment, and they affect investment because every country decides on the rules which keep its citizens safe. Every country decides on whether or not it wants to maximize revenue collection at the border, whether it wants to facilitate trade, whether it wants to be protectionist. Every country makes its own decisions in the interests of its citizens. And the P that I would add to the 5 Ps that Diane had is the idea of political will. Because much of what we do about borders and about border management comes down to political will and influencing political decision makers. And again, that's something to consider as we talk about borders and how to facilitate trade globally. So just a couple of points about who we are and who I am. I'm first of all the president of the Canadian Society of Customs Brokers, and customs brokers are licensed by governments around the world and are authorized legally to act on behalf of importers and exporters. The CSCB itself is an association which provides advocacy, education, professional development, and other services to customs professionals in Canada. We also, as many Canadian organizations do, we have taken on a leadership role in the international sphere, and we act as the secretariat for the International Federation of Customs Brokers Associations, or IFCBA. We have members in every region of the world, including Africa. Unfortunately, only 2 in Africa at this point, but perhaps more after this conference even. We have Angola and Nigeria, who are both represented here today. And internationally, we keep emphasizing that knowledge is the foundation for customs brokers' contribution to trade facilitation. It's knowledge which empowers women, it's knowledge which empowers business, and it's knowledge which empowers our members. And I think that no one knows better than women that knowledge does equal empowerment and that education equals empowerment. As the IFCBA, we have observer status at the World Customs Organization, where 179 countries, including all the African countries, meet from time to discuss how to make borders work better. And I'll tell you that many of the Directors General there from Africa are indeed women, and I have met many of your colleagues from your countries at the World Customs Organization. Now, the PSCG, another acronym, stands for the Private Sector Consultative Group, and the PSCG is an advisory body to the World Customs Organization. It represents all regions of the world and all elements of the supply chain, and I'll come back to the PSCG in a minute, but I chair that group. I started out as the only Canadian in a group of 30 business organizations and trade associations, again, representing all regions of the world and every element of the supply chain. The customs world still has a way to go with respect to women in leadership. I met with the Director General from New Zealand Customs the other day, who was in Montreal, and she said to me that she assembled her management team when she came into the Customs Department, and there were 120 managers in New Zealand Customs, and 5 of them were women. And she said what a lot of work she had to do, and she again was the first woman Director General of her Customs Department in a country like New Zealand. And I should tell you, again, you may see this back in your countries, but the World Customs Organization has recently focused on women in customs and women in leadership and management in particular. And there is a single-day symposium in Brussels at the World Customs Organization on women in customs leadership, and I'm going to be speaking at that along with a number of other people, and I think it's a really interesting discussion and conversation to have in terms of an organization like the WCO recognizing the issue that there is in terms of building its own capacity to advance women in customs administrations and in the WCO itself. So back to our Canadian organization, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Canadian Society of Customs Brokers, and I'll go quickly through these numbers. We have 160 corporate members. Those members account for the vast majority of transactions which come into Canada from every country in the world. We have a number of associate members, and the next number is a particularly interesting one because it talks about the footprint we have in the marketplace with respect to our commitment to education and professional development. We have almost 4,000 certified customs specialist designates, and we just launched a new designation, our certified trade compliance specialist, or CTCS designation, that has 185 designates at this point. We have a certified customs specialist course, it's distance education, it's online learning. And with respect to our certified trade compliance specialist, we're looking at developing and announcing quite soon a global international trade designation relating to customs and border management. So you may be interested in watching for that. Just jumping back to my private sector consultative group, I show this slide because, again, it shows large business, as you can see. And actually, it does show our newest member is from Africa. And it's SAB Miller, who I understand makes some of the finest beer in the world. I can't attest to that personally, but they're our newest member at the Private Sector Consultative Group. We've had previous members in the PSCG from South Africa and from Morocco. But when you look at these big businesses, there is an interconnectedness. And what those businesses will say is that they are intricately connected in all of their countries. And these businesses, as you know, just by looking at those logos, do business in more than 150 countries of the world. They have suppliers, distributors, partners, service providers who are all SMEs. So again, consider that even though these may be the voice of business globally at the World Customs Organization, talking about trade facilitation and borders, in fact, they are arguing for greater simplification and facilitation, not only on their own behalf, but facilitation that will impact small and medium-sized enterprises as well. Key players in the supply chain. Again, this is a very, very simple little diagram, starting with an importer and basically ending with an importer. And really, there isn't a line here, but again, goods cross borders. They don't just go down the street or are delivered to the next street in the neighborhood. And it really does start with the importer placing a purchase order with a supplier. There are requirements, again, for moving goods across border that you need to take into consideration. So let's go through that process. And again, we do start with an importer, and that could be a Canadian importer who will send a purchase order to a supplier, that's you, outside Canada. So that seems pretty straightforward. They want to buy something from you, you have supply, you want to provide it to them. So you, the exporter, then have to prepare documents, and again, that can be data, but documents to send the goods to Canada. Now, I'll say here that no one knows your goods better than you do. You know the composition, you know what they're made of, you know the process for manufacture, but you don't know what the requirements are necessarily to move those goods. To move those goods from Africa to Canada, let's say. You don't know what the requirements are, and it's not your core business to know. You don't have the knowledge to know what that is. So again, this is where you need some help, and as we walk through this process, I'll explain how you can get that help. So you prepare documents to send the goods to Canada. Again, Canada Customs invoice or commercial invoice. You have a packing list, you have a bill of lading. You may have other documents that are required. Again, it may be things that need permits or certificates or other kinds of things, because Canada wants to keep its citizens safe and secure, and we have regulations about all kinds of things that don't just mean that you can bring goods in duty-free, but that in fact you may need a permit from Health Canada. You may need something for our Agriculture Department or other kinds of things. So you then provide those documents to the carrier or freight forwarder, because those goods have to move. So they're the documents you know, it's the information that you've collected, and you provide those goods to the carrier or freight forwarder. The goods are on their way. So what does the carrier then have to do? Again, you've contracted the carrier, most likely. The carrier is responsible for preparing a cargo control document known as a manifest or a waybill. Before the goods arrive in Canada, the documentation provided by the supplier should be provided to the Canadian customs broker, or should be provided to the Canadian importer if that importer doesn't use a customs broker. Why is that? Because sending the documents to the broker in advance simplifies the customs clearance process. And that's what trade facilitation and moving goods across borders is all about. So what does the broker do? And again, the broker will be hired by the importer to facilitate the transaction, to interact with customs. Keep in mind the broker has the knowledge base. The broker will take care of providing all information required to release the goods through customs. And those goods are released on the basis of information provided by the supplier, the exporter, the carrier, the importer. So you can think of the broker really acting as an information hub. Now, when you think of the broker managing all of the information, again, we've talked a lot today about relationships. So you can think of that as the broker managing all of the relationships. So he's acting on your behalf as an exporter, but he's maybe dealing with hundreds of carriers and thousands of importers and exporters. So again, the relationship piece is incredibly important in terms of communication of requirements and in terms of facilitation of trade. And that's regardless of technology. I mean, technology does facilitate transmission of information, but it's relationships that really mean that the information is validated, correct, goes to the right place. That's all about relationships. And women, as we know, and as we've talked about today, are especially good at this. So the customs broker then is responsible for two key steps in getting goods through Canada Customs or Canada Border Services Agency. First of all, arranging their release from customs, and then accounting for goods. We have a two-step process in Canada, and paying duties and taxes. Now, that may require financial guarantees and security. Again, that will be something that will be arranged. And again, much has been said about sort of the financial piece for you as an exporter today, but there's also potentially a financial piece on import in terms of a guarantee or posting security to ensure that the obligation to pay duties and taxes is met. Other things that a customs broker can do is obtain a business number. I heard a lot today about the informal trade sector, and again, we talk about this a lot at the World Customs Organization, about managing the informal trade sector and what it means in terms of compliance and concerns about intellectual property rights and other sorts of things. So again, obtaining a business number in this country is a requirement for importing. Knowledge of prohibited goods. There are some things that just cannot come into this country. It doesn't matter what certificates or permits or standards you meet. Obtaining import permits for those goods which do require some kind of control mechanism. Advising of requirements and rules to prove origin, and again, Brian talked a little bit about origin, and I'll come back to that in a second, and awareness of marking and labeling requirements. Now again, even on consumer products, Canada is a bilingual country. There's a requirement for bilingual labeling. This even causes a problem with some of our trade with the United States, where an exporter will say, Canada's not a big enough market for me to do bilingual labeling, and it's just not worth the cost. So again, that's something to consider for you as an exporter. It's also something to ensure that you know what is required so that the trade is and the transaction is facilitated on the other side. I should also say that in many of your countries in Africa, the borders are really about, and border management is about maximizing revenue collection. There are statistics that show that Canada's, because we've negotiated a lot of free trade agreements, duty rates have fallen. Our percentage of duties as a contributor to our GDP is minimal in this country. And that's, perhaps 2 to 3%. In other countries, particularly in Africa, it is still a major, major contributor to revenue. So we're looking at countries which may have as much as 50% of their revenue from border duties. So you may have that view about what borders are about in terms of revenue collection because that's your experience in your own countries. That's not necessarily the case in the countries in which you're going to do business. So then what you have to look at are other issues relating to safety and perhaps more recently to security. For example, since September 11th, 2001, the world of borders has changed, and there are enormous requirements and in a way, obstacles that countries have decided they will implement to make us safe as citizens. So, again, another level of complexity in terms of doing business across borders. We're just going to go back to the documentation and data for a minute, and this sounds like a truism, but customs documents really are documents required by a customs department of a country, either at export or import. The documents that you provide to get your goods out of your country may not be sufficient to get them into another country. And again, we've talked about a commercial invoice, and I'll show that to you in just a moment. The documents are intended and used to accurately and completely identify the goods as well as quantity, price paid, and their origin. And customs administrations and border administrations everywhere in the world today are assessing and targeting for security purposes, as I just mentioned, as well as safety and trade purposes. The commercial invoice, again, this is what you're going to need when you're doing business. As I say, no one knows the goods better than you because you're manufacturing or exporting. So here are the things that you're going to need to include and provide. Common problems, again, which may seem simple, but it's not simple at all. Incorrect invoice information. You may not show a country of origin. You may not show additional charges. Your description of the goods may not be sufficient for import. The goods may be not properly marked, I mentioned that, missing certificates and permits, or incomplete transportation document. Now, let me just say that if any of these problems occurs, there are consequences. And the consequences are you may face delays in delivery because they won't move quickly across borders. So as a small exporter, you've missed fulfilling a contract obligation to someone who's purchasing from you. They will not do business with you again. So again, you need to have those processes in place, and there is a consequence to not having them in place. That's probably, one of the things that can happen. Another thing that can happen is you could be facing financial penalties. And if you're facing financial penalties, again, it can be incredibly destructive to a small entrepreneurial business that is just trying to get on its feet and trying to get traction to, sort of embark on a broader marketplace. Documentation error impacts, again, I've just said that. Delays in clearance of goods, penalties may be assessed, and errors may trigger a subsequent customs audit. That will be on the import side, not on your side, but again, your importer will not be happy if you haven't done your due diligence. I've just skipped through the next couple of slides because I know that we're running out of time. I just want to make sure that you're aware that even if your goods are duty-free, they may still be subject to requirements of other government departments or agency, and in Canada we have about 30 of those that care about what comes into this country. Primary concern is health and safety. Here's some of the things that may affect some of the products that you produce: Environment Canada, certain wood products, CFIA food items, Health Canada, drugs and medical devices, and of course Foreign Affairs and International Trade, which may have goods under quota. Origin, we talked about this a little bit. Origin is very, very complex, and again, getting to the origin proposition requires due diligence and expertise and knowledge, and again, Brian talked about that a little bit earlier. Let me just skip through this and get to for those of you who now are aware of my agenda, whether or not you'd like to think about becoming a customs broker in your own countries. Trade is complex, and it's not getting any easier. In spite of the fact that we have free trade agreements, there isn't harmonization in terms of how countries are negotiating those free trade agreements. We have a huge concern globally about that. So free trade is really a misnomer. And we see customs brokers here in Canada, and indeed in other countries, as the portal to customs compliance. And customs compliance is something that has been recognized as really significant by organizations like the World Customs Organization and the World Bank. In fact, we're doing some work with the World Bank in Laos, and we're also doing some work with the World Customs Organization in Vietnam. Both of those countries have recognized that trade facilitation really is impacted if there is not a licensed customs brokerage industry that has a foundation of knowledge. That in fact, again, a very powerful argument for trade facilitation is to build licensed and qualified customs brokers in these countries. So what about the customs broker and compliance? Again, here are the sorts of things that we educate about. Here are the sorts of things that are important to know. And it's not your core business as an entrepreneur. It's not your core business as an exporter to know this as well as you know the details of your product. You don't know what these requirements are in the countries to which you're exporting. We know the presentation will be made available to you, and there are questions you should ask when you're hiring a customs broker or when your importer is hiring a customs broker in Canada. Look about qualifications for handling goods, communication, compliance plan, try and mitigate all of your risks, financial and otherwise. Get reports from your brokers. How much will it cost? Get references from your brokers, sign an agency agreement, and find out, again, if you're dealing with an importer in Canada, whether or not their broker is a member of our organization. Getting the best value from your customs broker, and this could be getting the best value from any partner that you deal with in business. Match your expectations, make sure you understand what those expectations are. Clearly define what each of you are doing. Again, as an exporter, with your importer, with the importer's customs broker, we have some standard trading conditions and standard operating procedures that help you do this. And again, as women entrepreneurs, don't underestimate the value of looking into partnerships with customs brokers in your own country, or indeed even making the investment in education and knowledge to become a customs broker in your own country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol, and we won't be surprised now if we hear of some new customs brokerage firms opening up in a number of your countries. I'm looking for Lucien to indicate whether there's time for a couple of questions. That's an indecisive response, so I'll assume there's room for one burning question if there is one. Okay.
We have the B2B, very important. So.
Oh, there's no mic? Okay. Yeah, sorry. Give it to you.
I'm sorry? Yes, where's the... Chris, where's the... maybe the technician in the back will bring it to you. He's coming to you, madam. But you know, while we're waiting for that, these two organizations, TFO and the custom broker, are extremely important for you. There's no question. One will help you to export to Canada, and one will help you to bring the stuff in Canada. And I think they made great offer here of helping and working with you. If you want to take away something from this conference, these are two great takeaways. But you have to correspond with them, you have to work with them, and even become a custom broker yourself for your own country. Yes, madam, go for it.
I would want to know what percentage of goods from Africa and in Canada. This will serve as a source of encouragement for us. And then number two, why is it easier to bring goods to Africa, but not easy to bring goods from Africa into other continents? What are the challenges? Thank you.
I wish I knew the percentage off the top of my head, but I don't. But I know the answer is not enough. And that's why I think we're all collectively here, is to grow that proportion of trade. I can say, though, investment of Canada into Africa is very significant. And that's an important first step sometimes in developing trade. The question about why is it easier for products to go one way versus the other? It depends on the product, of course, but there's no question that the environment that we've just been describing of bringing products into Canada is one that's highly regulated. There's many standards that need to be met, whether it's for food safety, product safety, compliance with laws, and those are barriers that do take some time for exporters to overcome. Thankfully, there are many examples that we heard this morning, this afternoon, of businesswomen like yourselves that have overcome those difficulties.
See, one of the things that CC Africa is trying to do since its inception about 10 or 12 years ago is to help the economic relation between Canada and Africa. One of the things we get the most in terms of African country coming to us, working with them and so forth, is they want investment from Canada, and I understand that, and that's normal. But there are not many coming to us and say we want more export from Africa to Canada. Today is a conference almost strictly for that. That's what we want. And we've made sure that in the program, there is very practical stuff that can help you out to move in that direction. And I think that the High Commissioner of Rwanda and her colleague are looking at that, saying, how can we increase economic relation, investment to Africa, yes, but also export from Canada. And those are very practical tools that you've heard there a few minutes ago. And I'm working with DFAIT, I'm working with that, I'm working with CEDA. There's a lot of effort. Not easy, but we're trying very hard to make it better than it is now. Thank you very much, and we'll go to the next session now.